We are still on Unit 3, which is argumentative writing. This is now Lesson 4, where we'll talk about argumentative conclusions. So here's an interesting fact to get you thinking. In courtroom trials, they surveyed jurors, people who make decisions for cases, and they asked them what was the most influential part of the trial? What really changed your mind or made you think that this is the way you're going to go? And most jury members said it was really the closing arguments that were the most important part of the trial, right at the end, right before they decided. So I'd like you to think, why do you think this is? I think the obvious answer is it's the last thing you hear. It's the last thing that's on your mind as you're making these decisions. And I want to tie this into what you do for writing, because a lot of times we don't spend too much time thinking about how we want to close the paper, and it's kind of sad because this is really important. It's the last thing you're going to say to your audience. So don't just skip over that conclusion. Don't just get it done, but take your time and do a good job making good conclusions to your argumentative pieces. So in your argumentative structure, we do close your argumentative with a conclusion. We want to do a thesis in your conclusion, a summary, and a closing. Your thesis would be your main point of your argumentative restated, and you should have a summary where you review your supporting details or review each of your claims that you make, and then a closing where it's like a fitting and recognizable ending. Maybe go back to your hook. Let's talk about each one of these three. So in your restated thesis, this is the first part of your argumentative conclusion. So if you remember, you had a thesis in your introduction. So all you need to do is restate that thesis. Understand here that restated is not the same as rewritten. You should use a little bit of a different wording than you did in the introduction so you don't sound like a robot. Just for a few reminders, the big one here is that your argumentative thesis should mention the other side. So if you remember, this was a introduction thesis I had for minimum wage, and here I mentioned the other side, right? While many are fearful of a minimum wage increase, our city would experience numerous benefits of raising it to $12 per hour. So when I restate my thesis, then I'm going to use a little bit of different wording, but the same idea. Raising the minimum wage in our city to $12 per hour provides numerous benefits without too many costs. You see how I'm kind of mentioning the other side again right here. I'd like you to practice doing this now. So whatever your introduction thesis that you wrote from lesson 1, I would like you to take that thesis and restate it, meaning you're going to use different words to say the same idea. After you restate your thesis and your conclusion, you need to have a summary. You got to summarize your main points. It helps your readers remember what your points were, and it really sticks with them a lot longer after they've read your paper. When you summarize, you should do the following. Paraphrase your claims. The word paraphrase is kind of another fancy word for restate. So you should say your claims, but maybe in a different way and summarize them in some ways. And then, just don't use the same wording from before. Like I said, you don't want to sound like a robot. So under the topic of minimum wage, if these were my claims from my paragraphs that workers could earn a living wage, they'll spend more money helping the economy, and high schoolers can save more money for college for having a higher minimum wage, you could summarize them with these sentences. The living wage, see that, the workers can earn will also help the economy, see that, as they spend more. Those workers saving for college might benefit the most. So you see how I said all these ideas here for the most part, but I used different words to summarize and restate what I was saying earlier in the paper. When you've done your thesis and your summary, then you can finish your conclusion with a proper closing. So this is where you return to your hook and you create a memorable closing. And one way to do this is to return to your hook to create a memorable closing. The reason being is if you kind of mention your hook again, it feels like your paper's gone full circle and then it's ready to be done. So if you remember, I had this introduction hook. This was a hook for something against minimum wage, but we'll use it. And I'll read this introduction hook again just to remind you what it is. On the corner of 34th and Main Street, you can find the Purple Plum Diner. This diner has been owned by the Thiel family for 4 generations. However, things haven't been quite the same this past year. With the recent citywide minimum wage increase to $12 per hour, the family needed to raise prices to match costs. That has left the diner rather empty. We have only half the customers we had a year ago, said Shauna Thiel, the current owner. When I have my closing and my conclusion, then, if I mention something from the hook here, it really makes you feel like, okay, the paper's over. It has a beginning, has an ending, but they're related. So you see how I do it here? Businesses like the Purple Plum Diner don't deserve to be in their current situation. If they are forced to close, then everyone involved, the workers, the owners, and the customers all lose. If we lower the minimum wage back to a reasonable amount, then we can get back to business as usual. So that would be a closing that comes after your summary and your conclusion. It mentions the things from your hook to get you feeling like this is over, this paper is done. A couple other examples. You might remember this introduction hook. Is $8 per hour enough to provide for 3 children? Here's how I mentioned it in the closing. With 3 children, the extra $4 per hour could provide a single mother with much needed money for groceries, rent, or future college tuition. Keeping the minimum wage at $8 per hour takes those things away from her. Or even this introduction hook. If all Americans owned $100, over $45 of that amount would be owned by the richest 1%. See how I connect that with the conclusion? Clearly, the current minimum wage is so low. With the current minimum wage so low, rich business owners are benefiting greatly. Talking about these people, right? Isn't it time for the rest of America? So here I am saying essentially the same thing in my closing to give you that feeling of finality. I'd like you to practice this with your closing. I would like you to write a closing which matches the hook from your introduction. You might have to go back to lesson 1, whatever you wrote for your hook. Write a closing that finishes your paper but mentions your hook. This is a chart that I really recommend having out when you complete your conclusion. It just lists all the things you need to do in your conclusion paper. So the first thing here is you restate your thesis. And remember, you have take your introduction thesis and you just restate it. After that, you have a summary where you take your body paragraph claims and you paraphrase them, meaning it's another fancy word for restating them. After that, you take your closing where you have your introduction hook and you mention it and finish your paper with that. So have this out when you do your conclusion. Make sure you do a good job with those conclusions. When you get scored with your writing groups people, you will get scored in this section here with your conclusion paragraphs, and they'll score you based on how well you did your restated thesis, your summary, and your closing.